The school that never appeared on any map. A historical narrative. In the spring of 1923, a man named Clifford Mays drove his automobile down a road that did not appear on any parish map in Caldwell County, Louisiana, and found a school that had been operating for 40 years without the knowledge of any county official, any state inspector, any federal education surveyor, or any white resident of the parish who had not been specifically told about it by someone who had decided, carefully and deliberately, that this particular white person could be trusted. The school had 61 students enrolled that morning. It had a globe on the shelf above the blackboard. It had been there since 1883. 1. The survey. The Louisiana State Board of Education had ordered the survey in February of 1923 because federal education funds were being redistributed under a new congressional allocation formula, and the redistribution required the state to provide an accurate accounting of educational facilities serving the colored population across all 64 parishes. This was, on its face, a routine administrative exercise. In practice, it was the first time in the history of Caldwell Parish that anyone employed by the state of Louisiana had been formally tasked with finding out what black children in the parish were actually being taught, in what buildings, by whom, and under what conditions. The man assigned to conduct the survey was Clifford Mays, 31 years old, a field inspector with 4 years' experience traveling the rural parishes of northern Louisiana, recording the conditions of schools that most of his superiors in Baton Rouge had never visited and had no particular interest in visiting. He drove a black Ford Model T. He kept a ledger. He believed in documentation. He was not a man of strong convictions in either direction about race, not a reformer, not a defender of the existing order, simply a man who had been trained to record what he found and who found, when he looked closely at the schools of Caldwell Parish, something that his training had not prepared him for. He had visited 11 schools in the first 8 days of the survey. The pattern was consistent and dispiriting. White schools, built within the last 15 years, maintained by county funds, with wood stoves in every classroom, textbooks assigned 1 per student, teachers holding state certification. Black schools, built before 1900 in most cases, maintained by no one in particular, with no stoves, no assigned textbooks, teachers who were often uncertified not because they were unqualified, but because the certification process required access to training programs that the state provided only in cities and only at institutions that did not admit black students. The average black school in Caldwell Parish had 1 book per 7 children. One of the schools he visited had no books at all. It had a teacher, a woman named Ida Clark, who had been teaching for 11 years from memory and from a handwritten collection of notes she had assembled over the course of her career, and it had 43 students who attended when they were not needed in the fields, which during harvest season meant the school's enrollment dropped to 11. Mays recorded all of this in his ledger without editorial comment. He was thorough. He noted the condition of the building, the enrollment figure, the certification status of the teacher, the number of available textbooks. He noted that the roof had a section of collapsed boarding that had been awaiting parish repair funds for 3 years. He did not note his own reaction because his job did not require him to record his own reaction. On the 9th day of the survey, he was boarding with a family in the town of Columbia, and the woman of the house, a domestic named Adeline Fouché, mentioned while clearing the supper dishes that there was a school her grandchildren attended somewhere past the cypress stand on the far side of Miller Creek, and that they came home every afternoon having read things. Mays looked up from his ledger. "Which school?" he asked. Adeline Fouché folded her cloth over the edge of the sink and said it was just the school, and went back to the kitchen. 2. The road. He asked again the next morning, before she had left for work. She stood in the doorway of the kitchen for a moment, looking at him the way he would note in his private journal that evening. A person looks at someone they are trying to assess, not with hostility, not with warmth, but with the careful attention of someone who understands that a wrong answer will have consequences and is not yet certain what kind of man they are dealing with. Then she gave him the directions. They were precise. left at the Cotton Gin, south on the parish road for 2 miles to the junction with the timber company track, southeast on the track through the cypress stand for 4 miles, stop when the track ends in the clearing. The track was barely wide enough for his automobile. The cypress canopy closed overhead within the first 100 yards. For most of the 4 miles, the track ran through timber so dense that the morning sun reached the ground only in occasional broken columns of light that swept across his windshield as he drove, giving the journey a quality that he could only describe in his private journal as the quality of traveling through something rather than past it. He came out into the clearing at 8:30 in the morning. There was a building there, long and low, built of pine board with a tin roof, set with its east wall facing the clearing so that the double doors faced the morning sun. 12 windows, 6 to each long wall, propped open with lengths of cut wood. Through the open doors, he could hear voices. A class in session. He sat in his automobile without moving for longer than he would later be able to account for. He wrote only that he sat there for some time, and then he took his ledger from the seat beside him and stepped out of the car. 3. The building. The school had been built in the autumn of 1883 by a carpenter named Moses O'Bear, working with 4 other men from the congregation of Greater Zion Baptist Fellowship over the course of 11 weeks. Moses O'Bear had spent 12 years before the war building levees for the sugar parishes, learning from engineers who had no interest in acknowledging what he was learning, and had spent the decade after the war applying what he had learned to construction work in northern Louisiana that actually required the knowledge rather than the labor alone. He was 51 years old in 1883 and had the particular kind of authority that accumulates in a man when everyone around him has spent years quietly understanding that he is the person you consult when something needs to be built and needs to last. He built the school to last. The foundation was cut stone, not timber, because timber shifts with the wet seasons and cut stone does not. The framing was mortise and tenon, not nailed, because nails corrode and tenons hold. The roof was tin over solid boarding because a Louisiana summer produces rains that will exploit any weakness in a shingled roof within 5 years, and Moses O'Bear did not intend to roof this building more than once. The windows were sized and placed to create cross-ventilation on the axis of the prevailing summer wind, which in this part of Caldwell Parish came from the southwest, which was why the long walls ran northeast to southwest and the doors faced east. He built the desks himself, 24 of them, in the winter months of 1883 and 1884, when there was no construction work. Actual desks with attached bench seats, not benches serving as desks. He built them at the height his own children sat at, which was lower than most furniture of the era assumed, because the school was for children, and Moses O'Bear was a man who understood that you build for the thing's actual purpose. The congregation had purchased the land the year before, 2.5 acres, paid for outright, documented in a deed of sale recorded by a Shreveport title company, because the men of the congregation had understood that a title recorded locally could be subject to local interpretation, and a title recorded in Shreveport had at least the protection of distance and inconvenience. The school had no official name. The congregation called it the Fellowship School. The families called it the Zion School. The children called it the school. Clifford Mays, standing in the clearing in the spring of 1923, would come to understand that the absence of an official name was not an oversight. It was a considered position. 4. The teacher. The woman teaching the class that morning was Marguerite Fontenot Dubard. She was 54 years old, small and upright in the way of someone who has stood in front of a room of children for 22 years and has learned that presence is a posture before it is anything else. She had grown up in Caldwell Parish, the daughter of sharecroppers who had, by the time she was 10 years old, purchased 2 acres of their own with savings accumulated over 12 years of giving the landlord his portion and holding the remainder with the discipline of people who understood exactly what ownership meant in the terms available to them. She had attended the Zion School herself as a child, under its first teacher, a man named Reverend Solomon Price, who had held the school together for 17 years before his death in 1900. She had gone to Straight University in New Orleans in 1896, one of the historically black institutions established in the Reconstruction years and surviving by the 1890s, in the particular way such institutions survived, through a combination of Northern philanthropic support, the dedication of its faculty, and a collective refusal on the part of its students and administration to allow the ambient pressure of the post-Reconstruction South to determine what was worth teaching or learning. She had earned the equivalent of a teaching certificate in 1899. She had returned to Caldwell Parish in 1901 because Solomon Price's death had left the Zion School without a teacher, and because she understood, with a clarity that she had been moving toward for her entire adult life, that this was the work she was going to do. She had been doing it for 22 years when Clifford Mays arrived in the clearing. She did not look surprised when she came to the door of the school and found him standing there with his ledger and his Ford Model T. She looked, he wrote, as though she had been expecting something like this for some time and had decided, in the interval between the expectation and the arrival, what she was going to say. She invited him in. What he found. The school had 61 students enrolled that spring. They ranged in age from 6 to 14. They were organized by reading level rather than age, which meant that the 6-year-old who had been reading for 3 years sat beside the 11-year-old who had started the previous autumn. And the arrangement was entirely unremarkable to everyone in the room, except Clifford Mays. The library shelf held 67 books. Mays counted them. Among them, a complete set of the 1902 Encyclopedia Britannica, donated in 1907 by the estate of a woman named Clara Arsenault, who had been a member of the congregation and who had included them in her will, alongside a Latin grammar and a copy of Les Miserables in the original French. The French novel had been on the shelf for 16 years. No one at the school read French yet. Marguerite Fontenot Dubar had noted, in the ledger where she tracked the library's holdings, the word yet beside the entry for the French novel. She had been noting it since 1907. The Globe had been purchased in 1912 from a school supply company in New Orleans, ordered by post, paid for from the school's operating fund. It was a 12-inch globe, showing the world as it had been constituted in 1910. Marguerite Fontenot Dubar had, at some point in the previous decade, marked several of the colonial territories with small penciled notations. Mays did not examine these closely. He noted the globe's presence in his ledger. He sat in the back of the classroom for 2 hours. Marguerite Fontenot Dubar was reviewing fractions with a group of 12 children between the ages of 8 and 13. She was not using the textbook standard of the period, which taught fractions through abstract numerical exercises. She was using sharecrop contracts, real ones with the identifying details altered for privacy, but structurally real. What does a 3/8 share of a 100-bale harvest produce in dollars at current gin prices? What does it produce if the gin operator deducts the standard processing fee before calculating the share? What does it produce if the landowner has assessed a 20% equipment rental against the crop before the share is calculated? 2 of the children could do the calculation before she had finished writing the problem on the board. They did not make a show of this. It was, apparently, not unusual. Mays wrote in his ledger, "Remarkable instruction. Students measurably ahead of comparable age cohort in parish white schools." He paused. He looked at the room. He wrote, "Building unlisted. No county record of this institution." 6. Why it was not recorded. He asked her about it when the children had been dismissed for the afternoon, walking home in small clusters down the cypress track, each carrying a book borrowed from the school's library under the lending arrangement Marguerite Fontenot Dubar had established in her 2nd year of teaching, when she had realized that 67 books divided among 61 students at any given time produced a fraction that the children could have calculated themselves, but that she preferred not to have to explain. They sat at her desk, which was a plain pine table at the front of the room with a straight-backed chair and a surface covered in the organized evidence of 22 years of teaching. Lesson plans, correspondence, student notebooks stacked by class group, a small tin box with the school's monthly accounts, and the cloth-bound notebook that she handed to him without explanation, and that he opened to find, written in her careful, upright hand, a record of every student who had passed through the school since 1883. Names, dates of enrollment, years of study, a brief paragraph for each student who had gone on to secondary school or further education, with a note about where they had gone and, in many cases, where they were now. He counted 43 names in this second section. 2 students were currently enrolled at Grambling. 1 had graduated the previous spring. 1 was teaching at a school in Monroe. 1 was a licensed pharmacist in Shreveport. 1 had entered the Postal Service, which was among the few federal employment pathways available to black men in Louisiana in the 1920s. 1 had died in France in 1918, and beside his name, Marguerite Fontenot Dubar had written only his dates, his rank, and the name of the engagement. Mays looked at this for a long time. Then he asked the question that had been building since the morning. Why had no one reported this school to the parish board? She looked at him with an expression he would later describe, in the private letter he wrote that evening to his sister in Shreveport, as the expression of a person who has heard a question asked in the wrong direction and is deciding whether the person asking it is capable of understanding the correct direction. "Why would we?" she said. It was not a question. He began to answer, and she let him begin, and then she let the silence after his first sentence sit there long enough for him to hear it, and in that silence, he heard what she meant, which was this. The parish board was composed of men who had, for the previous 40 years, funded black education in Caldwell Parish at a level that produced schools with no books and collapsing roofs. To register with that board was to invite its oversight. To invite its oversight was to invite its judgment. To invite its judgment was to give it the authority to determine whether the Zion School met its standards. And the Zion School's standards were, by every measure Clifford Mays had applied that morning, higher than those of every official school he had visited in the previous 8 days. "If the board doesn't know it exists," he said, "the students here have no official standing, no transcripts. If they want to continue their education, the nearest secondary school that accepts these children is in Monroe," she said. 41 miles. She picked up the cloth-bound notebook. "I write the letters of recommendation myself," she said. "I describe the coursework. I document what they have studied and what they can do. The institutions that receive those letters understand what they are reading. 2 students at Grambling right now came from this classroom. The university did not require a county transcript. It required evidence of preparation. I provided that." She set the notebook back on the desk. "The county transcript would have said these children attended an unregistered school. The letter I wrote said they had read Dickens and could calculate compound interest and understood the constitutional history of Reconstruction. The university found the letter more informative." 7. The 40 years. What Marguerite Fontenot Dubar did not tell Clifford Mays that morning, because he had not asked and because certain things were not his to know simply because he had arrived with a ledger, was the full texture of what the 40 years had required. The school had existed, for those 40 years, in a permanent condition of deliberate invisibility. This was not passivity. It was a managed state, maintained by the congregation through continuous active effort in the same way that a levee is maintained, not by building it once and leaving it, but by watching it constantly and reinforcing whatever shows signs of weakness. The first requirement of invisibility was silence. The families of the congregation did not discuss the school with white residents of the parish. This was not difficult in the practical sense, because the social geography of Caldwell Parish in the 1880s and 1890s and 1900s was such that the sustained daily interaction required for information to travel from the congregation's community to the awareness of parish officials was not the normal texture of life, but it required a discipline, maintained across 3 generations of families, about what was said and where and to whom. Children learned this discipline early. They learned it the way they learned fractions, as something that was simply part of the world they were being prepared to navigate. The second requirement was financial self-sufficiency. The school received no public funds, No philanthropic grant, no outside support of any kind beyond the donations of individuals who specifically sought it out, which over 40 years had produced Clara Arsenault's book Bequest, a set of mathematics primers donated in 1898 by a teacher at a black school in Shreveport, who had heard about the Zion School through a network of such connections that was itself invisible to any official record, and a $20 gift from a man named Charles Whitmore, who had attended the school for 3 years in the 1890s and had sent the money from Chicago in 1919 with a letter that Marguerite Fontenot Dubard kept in the tin box with the accounts. The congregation paid for the school the way it paid for everything it had decided to have, by taking it seriously as a collective obligation and apportioning the cost in a way that was fair to the actual means of each family, which meant that the family with 2 acres and a steady harvest paid more than the family with a sharecrop contract and an uncertain income, and the family with the uncertain income paid what it could and was not made to feel the difference. In bad years, the crop failure of 1891, the 2 wet seasons of 1904 and 1905, the sharp economic contraction that followed the end of the First World War, the contributions fell and Marguerite Fontenot Dubard was paid less. She had a garden and the congregation supplemented what cash could not cover. She had not left. The third requirement, the one that was perhaps the least visible in any record but the most constant in the daily life of the school, was the maintenance of a standard that justified the sacrifice. The families were paying for the school out of resources they could not easily spare. They were maintaining a discipline of silence that had a social cost. They were sending their children 4 miles down a cypress track twice a day when they could, in theory, have enrolled those children in the officially recognized parish school in Columbia, which was closer, which was free, and which would have produced a county transcript. The reason they did not do this was sitting at the front of the classroom with 67 books and a globe and a cloth-bound notebook with 43 names of children who had gone somewhere. 8. The record. The notebook. Mays thought about the notebook that evening in his room at the boarding house, after he had written his official report and his private letter, and was lying on the narrow bed looking at the ceiling with the sense of a man who has understood something that he cannot quite yet assemble into a form he can use. The notebook was, in one sense, the school's entire claim to existence. There was no official record, no county document, no state registry entry, no federal survey notation. The land deed existed in Shreveport, but named only the congregation as owner of an agricultural parcel, with no mention of any educational use. The 40 years of the school's life had produced no paper trail that any official body could have followed to that clearing in the cypress stand. What it had produced was the notebook. 40 years of names, dates, progress notes, correspondence, outcome records. A handwritten archive maintained by 2 teachers. Reverend Solomon Price had kept the first 17 years, and Marguerite Fontenot Dubard had maintained it since 1901, with the discipline and completeness of people who understood that if you were not going to exist in the official record, you needed to exist somewhere, and the place you chose for that existence needed to be cared for accordingly. The notebook was not a substitute for official documentation. It did not confer legal standing. It could not be used to access public funds or satisfy a county inspector's requirements. What it was evidence of a different kind. Evidence that the school had understood, from its beginning, that it was producing something that mattered, and had decided to record it as though it mattered, which is a decision that only institutions that actually believe in what they are doing tend to make. Mays thought about the 2 children who had calculated the cotton share fraction before Marguerite Fontenot Dubard had finished writing it on the board. He thought about what those children would do the first time they signed a sharecrop contract, when the time came, and whether they would find the errors, which was what they had been taught to find. He thought about the entry in the notebook for the man who had died in France. He thought about the word yet beside the French novel entry in the library ledger. He picked up his pen and continued his letter to his sister. 9. What the report said and what happened. Next. Clifford Mays submitted his official report on the Zion School to the Louisiana State Board of Education in June of 1923. He described it as a previously undocumented private educational institution of the colored community, operating for an estimated period of 40 years on land held by the Greater Zion Baptist Fellowship of Caldwell Parish. He noted the enrollment, the building condition, the instructional quality, the library holdings, and the documented outcomes for students who had proceeded to secondary and higher education. He recommended that the school be offered the option of formal registration with the state board, with access to the parish education funds to which it would thereby become entitled. He did not recommend investigation into the school's 40 years of unregistered operation. The word "yet beside the French novel" had stuck with him. He decided, and this was perhaps the most consequential editorial decision of his professional career, not to call attention to the legal ambiguity of the school's historical status. The State Board acknowledged the report. A clerk filed it in the Caldwell Parish folder. A form was generated and sent to Marguerite Fontenot du Bard inviting the school to begin the registration process. The registration process required, among other things, a structural inspection, teacher certification documentation, a formal curriculum submission, and a letter from the parish school board indicating no objection to the school's operation. Marguerite Fontenot du Bard submitted everything except the parish board letter, because the parish school board had not been informed of the process, the form from the state board having been sent directly to the school without any notification to the county level. When the county level was eventually notified, the response was not a letter of no objection. The response, delivered in the language of bureaucratic procedure and meaning what it was designed to mean, was a formal declaration from the Caldwell Parish School Board in 1925 that it did not recognize the Zion School as a legitimate educational institution and that students enrolled there could not be considered to have met state attendance requirements. The meeting. The congregation met on a Saturday morning in August of 1925. The church was full. Families had traveled from the far end of the parish. Several men who had not been inside the building in years were there. The children were kept in the fellowship hall. The adults talked for 4 hours. The substance of what was said was not recorded in any document that survives. What survives is the decision they reached at the end of the 4 hours, recorded in a single line in the congregation's minute book. Resolved, that the fellowship school shall continue in its present form. 4 hours of argument, of fear, of whatever was said about the costs and the risks, and the 23 students currently enrolled who had now been told by the county that their schooling did not legally count, and the resolution fit in one line. What was argued in those 4 hours can be reconstructed, imperfectly, from later testimony. The risk of remaining unregistered was real. Children without official educational standing would face formal barriers when they sought further schooling, employment in the postal service, or any of the other narrow pathways that required documented credentials. The alternative, acceptance of the county's authority, negotiation with the same board that had for decades maintained the conditions Clifford Mays had spent 8 days recording in his ledger, offered official standing at the cost of control. The congregation had built this school. They had paid for it for 42 years. The land belonged to them. The building belonged to them. The books belonged to them. The globe belonged to them. The notebook belonged to them. The word yet beside the French novel entry belonged to them. The county was now offering to tell them whether it met standards. They resolved to continue in its present form. 11. The continuation. The school taught its students for the next 38 years. Marguerite Fontenot du Bard retired in 1941 at 72 years old, 40 years after she had returned from New Orleans to stand in front of Solomon Price's classroom and decide that this was the work she was going to do. The congregation held a formal ceremony. They gave her the notebook. She kept it on the shelf beside her bed until her death in 1949. Her successor was a woman named Estelle Broussard, who had been 9 years old when Marguerite Fontenot du Bard arrived in 1901, who had sat at one of Moses Aubert's desks and learned to read a sharecrop contract, who had gone to Grambling, who had returned. She taught at the Zion School for 16 years, through the legal changes of the early desegregation era, through the Brown versus Board decision of 1954, through the slow and contested reorganization of Louisiana's school system in the years that followed. The Zion School closed in 1963. By that year, it had operated for 80 years. It had educated, according to the final entry in the notebook that Estelle Broussard completed on the last day of the last class, and donated to the archive at Grambling University, 612 students. None of them appeared in the official educational records of Caldwell Parish. The school appeared on no county map, no state registry, no federal survey conducted before 1923, no official educational record of any kind for the first 40 years of its existence, and in no recognized county record for the following 40. 12. What remained? The graduate student who found Clifford May's private letter in the Louisiana Tech Archive in 1997 was writing a dissertation on undocumented black educational institutions in rural Louisiana in the post-Reconstruction period. Her name was Dr. Patricia Sellers. She was 34 years old. She had been looking for the letter for 6 months, working from a footnote in a 1954 county history that mentioned, in the context of a discussion of educational consolidation, a long-operating private school of the colored community in the Miller Creek area, whose history had not been fully documented. The footnote gave no source. She had worked backward from it through 3 archives and 2 county offices before someone at Louisiana Tech mentioned that there was a collection of papers from a state field inspector named Clifford Mays that had been donated by his niece in 1987 and had not yet been fully cataloged. The letter was in a folder marked Personal Correspondence, 1923 to 1924. She read it in the reading room in 45 minutes and sat there for another half hour before she could begin her notes. She found the Grambling archive 6 weeks later. The notebook was there, in acid-free housing in the university's special collections, donated in 1967 by Estelle Broussard's family as part of a broader donation of materials from the school. It had not been described in any finding aid. It was listed in the collection inventory as Manuscript Journal, Educational Records, undated. She opened it and read the first line of the first entry. It was written in the hand of Reverend Solomon Price, in brown ink that had faded to the consistency of watercolor, on a page that had been folded at some point and refolded back flat. The date was September 4th, 1883. The entry recorded the enrollment of the school's first class. 17 students, ranging in age from 6 to 14, whose names were listed in careful alphabetical order, with a note beside each name giving the family's location and the father's occupation, and in some cases a brief notation about the student's prior learning. Can read some, Bible only, knows letters, not words, no prior schooling. Beside the name of one student, a girl of 9 named Theodora, was written, reads well, advanced beyond class level, to be given additional material. There was no further annotation. The next entry was for September 11th and concerned the delivery of 3 books donated by a church in Ruston. Patricia Sellers turned the pages slowly, reading through 40 years in Reverend Solomon Price's hand, then 17 years in the careful upright script of Marguerite Fontenot Dubard, then the final 16 years in Estelle Broussard's somewhat smaller, more compressed hand, the hand of a woman writing in a period when the pages were filling up, and she was perhaps aware that she was writing toward an ending. The last entry in Estelle Broussard's hand was dated June 7th, 1963. It listed the names of the final graduating class, 9 students. Beside each name, a destination: Monroe, Grambling, Baton Rouge, Shreveport, Chicago. Below the list, in the same hand, was a single sentence. Patricia Sellers wrote it into her dissertation without alteration and cited it in the epigraph of the book she published 10 years later on the history of undocumented black education in Louisiana. The sentence read, "The school was real, and what it made in the children who came here was real, and no record kept or not kept can change that." Below the sentence was the date, and below the date was the name, Estelle Broussard, teacher, 1941 to 1963. Below the name, the page was blank. The building in the cypress clearing was demolished in 1971 to make way for a timber access road. The land was sold by the Greater Zion Baptist Fellowship in 1969, the congregation having declined in the years after integration to a size that could no longer maintain its property. Moses Aubert's stone foundation was broken up and used as road fill. The globe, the blackboard, and 23 of the library's surviving books were donated to the Grambling Archive with a notebook. The French copy of Les Miserables, its spine repaired twice over 80 years with cloth tape, was among them. The penciled notation beside its catalog entry, the word "yet," was still legible.